Thank you, everyone, for your patience and for this short break. I want to say hello, everyone. So please, if you can come to your seat shortly, that will be great. Okay, thanks. I'm Paola Benavente. I'm a second-year student in the MPID program, a master program here in the Harvard Kennedy School. And actually, I'm also a research assistant for the Remining in the Economy project. Our next session is Industrial Policy for SMEs. Please join me in welcome our designate panelists. Jie Bai is an assistant professor in public policy at Harvard Kennedy School. She has engaged her research across China, East Africa, Southeast Asia, collaborating with governments and non-governmental organizations to design, implement, evaluate policies related to industrial development, trade, and broader economic development. Michela Giorcelli is an associate professor at the Department of Economics in UCLA. Her research is focused in the managerial and technological drivers of productivity and innovation in the long run. Andres Zahler is an associate professor at the School of Management and Economics of Diego Portales University in Chile. He has also served as a consultant for the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank, IDB, in areas of innovation, economics, and scientific and technological policy. He has also advised the Chilean Ministry of Economy on innovation, policies, and productive development. And finally, the moderator for this panel is Asim Khwaja. He is the director of the Center for International Development and the Harvard Kennedy School. It's now my pleasure to hand over the precedence to Professor Khwaja.
Great, thank you so much. And so I thought we'll jump straight in. I'll just make a few remarks in the beginning and we just sort of jump straight in. I've been trying to negotiate my fellow panelists down from 10 to 5 minutes, but we'll see where we end up in equilibrium, because I thought the more we can get kind of a discussion going both amongst the panelists is fun, but also sort of bringing you in. And so the idea would be the first half is kind of amongst ourselves, and then hopefully for the second half, we open up to the audience and get some of the ideas. I'd also encourage you, as you've been hearing previous panels, if there's stuff in those panels that you think are linked to what we're saying, draw the connection, because I think it's fun to draw the threads throughout. So let me just start by saying a few words. So one of the things is, obviously, as we think about sort of SME policy, I feel like SMEs often end up being like the orphan child of industrial policy. Which is, you know, it's great to have SMEs and we'd like to do SMEs, but it feels like a little luxury, or it feels like a bit of CSR on the side. And so when many banks say, hey, we really care about small and medium enterprises, and when you kind of look at their portfolio of lending, it turns out there's very little of the S, there's more of the M, and even the M is more like an M+. And so this idea of what it means to truly promote small and medium enterprises, and not just because it kind of feels good, or there's something sort of helpful in terms of employment, but really these can be real engines of growth for you. They can be flexible engines of growth for you. They can be adaptable engines of growth for you. They can really be your front runners. I don't mean necessarily a canary in a coal mine kind of front runner, but I mean front runners in terms of being just very flexible, very light, being able to take advantage of what may be happening in the ecosystem in a way that a larger firm may not be able to. And then when you start aggregating them up, you can say, well, one small firm, what can it possibly do? When you think of these as cluster of firms, you can start seeing really adaptable, rapid kind of change happening. And I think in today's world, with all sorts of things happening, all sorts of opportunities coming up, we should increasingly start viewing SMEs as really a powerful engine of innovation, growth, advancement in an economy. And I'm hoping we're going to bring that in. And I have sort of 3 fabulous panelists who will give us different ways of thinking about this question. For Jie, both in terms of just really getting into the microeconomics, if you will, of how SMEs operate, the ecosystem they face in, the information asymmetries they may be in, and perhaps even, Jie, if you have time, even thinking a bit about in the broader discussion, how do we think of SMEs in a modern digital era? What does it mean to be a sort of deep AI-enabled SME, and so I think there'll be fun sort of conversations there. And then I'd love the idea of sort of bringing in history. You know, there's a sense in which we kind of get so excited about the future, but we don't realize that a lot of the things we're trying may have been tried. They're lessons from history. They're lessons from industrial policy and planning, starting from the Marshall Plan onwards. And we have a real expert in that. So I'd love to kind of draw in the sort of what do we know from history, which can help us chart a more promising future. And then our own ex-student who has had an amazing career both in academia and practice. So bringing some of these ideas that we're hearing both from sort of latest frontier research, a more kind of historical perspective, but also what does this mean for actual practice? When you're out there in the world trying to do industrial policy, to do SME policy, what are the realities of the constraints you face? How do you bring in some of these ideas in ways that are both sound technically in the way we'd like to think about it, but also have practical bite and are sustainable. So with that, the order I'll ask our panelists to be in is in the order that they're sitting. I think some of them are using slides. Some of them are just going to talk some of the ideas through. So Jie, I'll start off with you.
Thanks, Asim. It's a great pleasure to be on this panel. So most of my work have been, working with SMEs firms in developing countries. So I will tell you more about some of my experiences there. And so Asim instructed us to keep our opening remarks short. So let me just put forward this kind of one very simple framework of how, I guess, microeconomists think about firms, SMEs or large firms in any country. So the way that we conceptualize firms is essentially firm is an entity that transforms a bundle of inputs through its in-house production, efficiency, some technology into some output. And then eventually you want to sell your output, thinking about market access, all of that. So if that's the kind of the sort of the microeconomic model of firms, then we can think about the drivers for firm growth or upgrading. The flip side of that is barriers and constraints. So there are several things. From the input side, we want to think about firms' access to high quality inputs that could include both human capital and also financial capital, right? Capital access, physical capital access. And there's also the question of the innate productivity, the efficiency of the firm, the technology the firms are using that allows them to either efficiently or inefficiently that transform the inputs into output. And then once you have the output, it's not the end of the whole process. You need to find ways to market, to act, to brand your firm, and to sell the output to the right market. And of course, firms don't operate in a vacuum. There's all this institutional context that affects firms' growth and upgrading. So that is a very kind of overarching framework. And I wanted to make 3 points to think about SMEs in particular SMEs in developing countries. One thing is that it is very common that you're going to find multiple constraints binding at the same time. So I think we all know that there's no one policy that will address all problems. But here, working with SMEs in developing countries, the question is, how can, with multiple constraints binding at the same time, how can we even design one policy that works effectively, that can push certain, identified set of firms, to start the growth trajectory. So I think that involves, back to some of the earlier conversations we had this morning, a lot of that would involve coordination among it could be different public agencies, government bodies, to design that effective policy tool that could help SMEs to overcome multiple barriers at the same time. And targeting is also, it's very important and very challenging to find the right firms for the right policy tools for the right firms. When you look at SMEs, it's really wild. A lot of firms are facing different constraints, and how can we find the right policy to target? So I prepared some slides with my working in Rwanda, working jointly with the Rwandan government to try to think about one of the major export promotion policy, which is to provide financial credits like subsidized interest rate loans to firms to promote exporting. And the initial phase of that program, if you read the original policy document, a lot of that is specifically thinking about SMEs, wanting to help SMEs to overcome these financial constraints and to start exporting. But the reality is during the first 6 years of the program, most of the current beneficiaries are very large firms. So it is not reaching the SMEs, which was the original policy target. So we're now thinking about, how can we improve the design of the program and extend the reach, to benefit more SMEs in the economy, like those who are export ready, who are high quality, high promising SM firms in the country. That's the first point I want to say. The second point related to this idea about multiple constraints may be binding. So, some economists, at least, we've been thinking about these constraints into two broad buckets. The first is this kind of supply side constraint, which include, providing technical trainings to firms, management practices, and also credits, and also high quality, labor market inputs, access. And also thinking about incentives within the firm to overcome organizational issues. So these are all kind of the supply side constraints and the interventions to try to overcome them. But I think there has been relatively much less attention on the demand side, which is the market access. Do firms even have the right incentive to upgrade, to grow? Do they face the right market incentive? And a lot of that, once you start thinking about supply side, demand side, it is very very intuitive that these two are going to be very complementary. Just fixing one side is probably not enough to start the growth miracle. And oftentimes what we need is not just like a one-side intervention, is a market level intervention that needs to confront challenges from both ends. That's the next thing I want to say. The last point is just thinking about SMEs and the broader economy, that I do want to, let me skip all of this in the interest of time. We can come back to some of this. So I read this article a few days ago, which was fascinating to me. This is, so Asim, you were saying how, SMEs were kind of sort of at the left behind kind of in the industrial policy space, but in China, the landscape is changing. So in the earlier phase of China's industrial policy, a lot of that is on large firms, SOEs. But it's clear like these days, a lot of the SMEs are taking a center stage in China's industrial policy planning. And this is what it was known as the Little Giant program, is a multi-tier program that tries to cultivate growth of SMEs. It's very much like it operates like a sports league. You start from each tier has its own government certified names. You start from the bottom, and any firm can apply. So in particular SMEs, you apply to the province at the local level, and then if you get qualified, you get a whole bundle of different support. It's not just financial support. It's a lot of comprehensive bundle of support to help you to move up the tier. And then they're going to do evaluations. It's a combination of state guidance with market evaluation. At the end of the a 3-year window, they will evaluate the impact, the firm performance, and decide whether you're going to move up or move down. And if you move up one tier, you get a even better package of support, and to keep moving up until you become the little giant or the manufacturing champions So I think the reason why China is doing this is particularly because China, the government did realize that in thinking about innovation and what is the powerhouse that drives economic growth, then the SMEs play an important role. So Barry this morning was telling us about the self-reliance as one of the key rationale for Chinese industrial policy. For a lot of the supply chains, you can imagine SMEs, they have an advantage to provide high-tech specialized inputs to many large downstream firms. So that's why, but a lot of these niche high-tech sectors, it is exactly what SMEs and their comparative advantage is at. So I think because of that, so China is trying to mobilize a lot of resources these days to try to promote the growth of SMEs. I think in terms of the effectiveness, I think this is very recent. I think the jury is still out, right? Whether this scheme works or not, and there are definitely problems within the system.
Awesome. Thank you, Jie. Jie has many slides, which we hope will come back in our discussion. Jie, you should give me a little nudge when those slides are relevant, and we'll bring them back in. But I assume they're about the Rwanda study, and so. And actually, for the e-commerce one, maybe spend a couple of minutes, because I think there's a lot of interest there as well. So if you want to show those slides, I don't want to. You've been very dutiful with your time.
You give me 4 minutes.
I give you a couple more minutes on
so
the.
Yes, I wanted to. So in terms of thinking about supply side and demand side constraint, one thing is giving SMEs market access. So they may have the capability to produce high quality products, but the question is how can we help them to reach to the right segment of the global market or the right part of the domestic market. And here, the global e-commerce could play an important role, because if you think about exporting, online exporting, the barriers of online exporting is much lower in some sense. The entry barrier is much lower than traditional offline exporting. And this is so AliExpress, which is one of the largest global B2C global e-commerce platform. You go to their website and they explicitly mention SME. Our mission is to help SMEs to succeed, and by giving them access to millions of billions of consumers around the world. So you can every firm can start a shop online, and then they have access to the global market. But I think the one thing I want to highlight is that it's not just if you actually go to AliExpress, this is what you see. Because entry barrier is so low, this is like there's a huge market congestion. There's many firms selling identical looking products. So then, if you're a high quality, imagine you're a high quality SME, I have amazing t-shirts, I want to sell my products to the world, and you enter this market, no entry barrier, all subsidized, but you have no sales history and no review history. So how can there's a cold start problem for many SMEs operating on the digital platform. So I think the question is, again, this is like one policy that is not going to address all problems. Many governments, many countries are running this kind of large-scale onboarding programs to onboard thousands of SMEs onto existing large e-commerce platforms, hoping that they're gonna grow. But they're not going to grow. So so we've done some qualitative case analysis with Indonesia, which had this massive onboarding program where they onboarded 20,000 SMEs in 2 years onto existing large platforms. But what happened is that a lot of these firms just stay dormant for, after a 3 period of time. They received a lot of training in terms of how to operate on the digital economy, the marketing, how to market, how to brand, how to set up pictures, all of that. But the constraints is not just that. The technical training is needed, the market access is needed, but also something else. Some other support is needed to really start the growth process. I think so. We had a paper on this, and I think one of the takeaway there is that thinking about information kind of interventions, because what's really holding back the growth of a lot of these high quality SMEs is that they don't have a credible way to signal their quality or their reliability to the market. Yeah.
Thank you, Jie. Michela?
Hello? Yes. Okay, perfect. So first of all, thank you so much for the invitation and for such an inspiring conference so far. And I'm very happy to bring an economic history perspective into the debate of industrial policy that I think it's important because studying industrial policy through the lenses of economic history allows us to capture some aspect that is harder to get with modern data. For instance, what is the long-term effect of the policies or how the world change in the long run as a consequence of these policies. Of course, when we look at historical papers and look at historical data, we have to acknowledge that the world has changed in the meanwhile. So we have to carefully think about what is the external validity of what we study, and I know that Nathan is with me a lot on this, but how can we apply our findings to modern world? But it's also true that some countries that are developed today were not so developed when industrial policy was implemented, and so could be good examples for today's developing countries. My research has focused and still focusing large part on studying the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan could be considered one of the largest industrial policy intervention in the world, in the sense that, in the history, in the sense that on top of providing economic, financial aid to Europe in the years right after World War II, also try to foster industrial development by sharing managerial knowledge and technology from US firms to European firms. The particular feature of the Marshall Plan was that it focused on small and medium-sized firms that were so important for the European economic development. And in particular, Marshall Plan intervention targeted already existing firms. So usually when we think about industrial policy, we're thinking about creating development from scratch, while for the Marshall Plan was strengthening areas or firms that were already existing. And another interesting feature of the plan, this is more from the economic perspective or the economic publication perspective, in a sense, is that as most industrial policies have some natural variation, what the economists call identification. We like it a lot. And so one of the challenge, of course, of evaluating industrial policies that areas that receive more aids or are those that need it the most, or firms that receive business training interventions, or those that are more willing to participate in the same. And what happened, at least in the context of Italy, is that the Marshall Plan had a pilot phase that was supposed to happen at the largest scope that eventually was implemented. And so we have firms that could decide whether they want to receive training in managerial practices, technology from the US, or both at the same time. And once this choice was made and the plan checked that these firms were in good health, so we're not talking about firms very close to bankruptcy that wanted this intervention just to survive. Okay, so when this choice was already made, the scope of the pilot phase was dramatically reduced, and so only a few of the original firms ended up receiving the training. And so comparing firms that got and didn't get the training, but conditional on the desire of receiving it, gives a very nice comparison, and it's helpful to interpret the effects of industrial policy. And what I find is that firms that had the opportunity to send their managers in the US were able to grow a lot. They grow in terms of output, in terms of productivity, in terms of employment, while perhaps surprisingly, the firms that received technology from the US were not able to grow that much. There is a short-run effect that disappears pretty soon. So just to give you a sense of the magnitude, if you're thinking about firms that send their managers to the US and that were supposed to send the managers to the US but did not, in 15 years, firms that send their managers in the US had a 50% productivity increase, which is huge. While firms that receive the machines from the US had an increase in productivity around 10% in the first few years, and then the effect gradually faded away. So why was the case? Why was industrial policy so effective on these firms by transferring managerial practices? And what I find, again, at least in the context of Italy, is that not only firms learned something that was important for their production, for instance, implementation of standard managerial practices that reduce scrap output, downturn of the machines, labor turnover, and so increase production and productivity. But also some constraints that we think as binding for small and medium firms that became less binding once these firms got better. We can think, for instance, access to capital market, that is a big problem for small and medium-sized firms. So firms, even without receiving any technology, any machine, any money from the US, were still able to access more credit. And we can think, if we believe that the managers can select better managers can select better investment projects, this money could have been, this is something that I cannot directly measure in the paper, but we can think that these firms were able to not only invest more, but also invest in better projects. And the other important channel is that they were able to do structural transformation, opening new plants, becoming bigger. They were also more likely to become professionally managed instead of being family managed. So those are usually the constraints that small and medium firms are. Sometimes firms don't have a desire to grow, or they realize that to get bigger, they should undertake profound structural changes, and they may not have the capacity or the willingness of doing so. By contrast, the effect of technology did not produce this result, did not make this constraint for firm less binding. And so one question could be why it is the case? And the potential answer is that the managerial practices could be transferred, but more easily adapted at the scale of production of firms. You can think that Italian small and medium-sized firms in the 50s were very different from big US firms that produced a lot during the war, that survived the war, and so on. By contrast, technology could be much harder to adapt. If the scale of production between sending and receiving firms is very different, then it could be harder to fully implement the utilization of new machines. And this could not have the results in terms of output or productivity increase that we're hoping for. And so I think that the lessons that we can learn from economic history is that the type of industrial policy, the type of intervention that is given to firms could have both a direct effect in terms of what firms learn, but also an indirect effect in terms of what kind of constraint could small and medium-sized firms could help. And this reminds me a very influential paper by Marianne Bertrand and Antoinette Score titled "What Capital is Missing in Developing Countries." And well, we can think that to some extent Italy in the 50s was a developing country, we'll see today maybe. No, it's like, but in terms of industrial output or agricultural share, it was definitely comparable to some developing countries today. And so the type of constraint that firms, of difficulties that firms were facing back then could be very similar to some challenges that firms are still observing today in developing countries. Yeah, sure.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank the opportunity of being here. As you already mentioned, Asim, I was a student for a long period of time here, almost 7 years, and I'm
not
very
all in a PhD, in case you're working.
No. They were hard on me, but not that hard. So it's also a humbling experience as a Lesio of always having been on the other side and being able to try to give some ideas and a couple of lessons on my experience. More, I would say, even though I've been working in both on the, like in academia, but I would say even more in government and supporting government, a little bit of I would say, practitioners. More than experience, I would say frustrations on the issue of industrial policy on one side and the connection with SMEs on the other. But before going into that, connecting with actually what for part of the audience that's here present today, just to give some acknowledgement that today, for example, in my country, Chile, and other countries in South America, a lot of the issues we've been talking here and the conceptual frameworks and theories we have talked about are being implemented and used actively in policy. On the one hand, what Ernesto Stein was actually showing in terms of how to think about proactive development policies, or more in general, I would say innovation policies, that some of them are horizontal, vertical, market interventions, or public goods have been, I would say, a very interesting way of thinking of what we have been doing, and particularly Latin America not doing, as you were mentioning before, in terms of more vertical interventions and how to do them right. Also part because of the fear we have of doing them wrong in current times. And the other one is the mission, well, growth diagnostics, of course, and the binding constraints, but I also wanted to mention, and it's related to government bandwidth and government capabilities, which is something I want to mention here, about the relevance and not only conceptual, I would say even communicational of missions as concepts in order to push policies beyond horizontal and neutral policies into more, I would say, vertical or directed, be it regional or in specific areas. But it has one, I would say, and one way to show that is that we in Chile started enacting during the current government the idea of thinking about what to do in terms of vertical policies, in terms of missions. And I was pretty surprised to see that other ministries started approaching the Ministry of Economy, where I was working at, to be part of, in this case, we call it a nuevo modelo de desarrollo. It was very like big thing. We wanted to end up being very small, but like a new way of developing in the country. Another minister started approaching and said, how we can be part of this? How can we like join forces with you, which I never saw before, as we have talked about, silo way of working prevails. but when there's some, I would say, this in a like way of putting goals in a discursive way, or in a I would say, I don't know how to call it, communicational way that is different. It's incredible how you start seeing people that are from other places in government to start being part of something like this. But the counter side of this is that
Andres said he had 3 slides. It would take him 10 minutes. I'm now realizing why. Because you're still on your title slide.
Yes.
I'm noticing.
Yeah. But it's part of.
I will add you to slide 1.
Yeah, no, I will jump to 3 immediately. No, but I wanted. I forgot what I was saying. So the other side of it, or the other side of the coin, is that in traditional, like the idea of coordinating the public sector with the private sector, when you have, for example, sectoral policy, is, I would say, in the end, much easier, and you need less bandwidth than when you think about missions, when you need to coordinate different ministries and different areas of government. And one of the things that I wanted to stress here is, and it was already said, but in practice, how you can even feel the limited bandwidth that we have in government to be able to implement these kind of policies. And it was that strong that I actually tried to, and that connected to the fact that when you think about, I would say, from Ernesto Stein's perspective and their book from IDB, from vertical policies, I couldn't find many policies that actually connected the idea of industrial policy in that sense with SMEs. In the sense that typically these policies end up supporting and working with big companies. And typically you see a lot of SME policies, but tend to be more open SME policies, not directed towards specific sectors. So I end up thinking of what if we think about SMCs for a second before jumping into thinking about what policies can connect the two worlds. And basically thinking about countries in a way of being small and medium. Okay, and these are some of the things that you can think of. Sorry, let me go back of problems of SMEs. It could be thought about supplier demand constraints, right? But it can also be thought about countries and governments that have these constraints to enact innovation policy in particular, and I would say industrial policy as a subcomponent. And it's pretty frustrating to have worked and supported countries in, for example, through the World Bank in terms of the idea of scale. Here we have talked about like policies that are in the trillions or billions. And when you think about a subset of countries that we are more like, I'm closer to, Latin America, and some European countries that are still in the developing phase, like Croatia, or I recently went to Georgia a couple of weeks ago to support their policy mix. If you take a look at the whole expenditure in R&D, or even in like science and technology in the country, and in the case of Chile, which is a country that other Latin American countries look at as a model, we spent $1 billion a year, the country as a whole, in R&D. A regular auto company in any country spends more than the whole country in a year. So there's an issue of scale, and whatever you want to do, you're not going to be able to move the needle with the issue of scale. And it's something similar with SMEs. So I'm thinking of similar problems for countries in that sense. In the case, and there are ways of actually like getting around this. In the case of Europe, for example, Croatia, something interesting I found out is that the expenditure is relatively relevant, but 80% of it comes from European funds. So from this type of country's perspective, the ability to actually have resources to spend on this is very, very hard. And you need support from somewhere else. You need, it's very hard to get. And it's frustrating when you try to enact good policies, but you don't have the resources to do it. And the other side of that is, well, I'm gonna I'll probably take a couple of them only because you're gonna kick me out. But the idea of also essentially capabilities, both in the public and private sector, I would say, commenting on what Piero was mentioning yesterday, also on the private sector side, where you need not only skills on the public sector people to be able to actually, and are not, I would say, typical technical skills. It's skills of coordination skills we're not taught, not even in the Kennedy School, for example. More and more the idea of management, or how to connect within the public sector and with the private sector, is something that you require these capabilities that are are very time intensive. You don't know how to do them, and it's in a way experimenting. On the private sector, you have the similar issue of probably less skills in the sense of participating in this, and a reduction in, for example, in the case of some of our countries, of the effect of deindustrialization is that we are having also less capabilities in terms of actually working on these policies in such a way. I remember Ricardo Hausmann when he came to my country some time ago, just for the sake of bothering us. Okay, 30 seconds? Okay, 2 minutes. He said that Chile didn't even know how to do copper. So we are actually, like many of our countries, in particular mine, we know how to, we support many things, but the capabilities of how to do things have been lost in many of our countries due to the industrialization, and that also affects the way to enact these policies. And the last thing to point out, and then I'm going to jump to a final slide, is that, and it's something that Charles Sable was also mentioning before, that the other thing that I think matters a lot when building policies from countries that are SM countries, small and medium-like countries, in this sense, is the fact that of the short-run horizon and the lack of capability to keep policies in time to make them at least know if they work or not. In some of our countries, where you enact a policy and you don't not even looking at the results, and the next government or the next administration enact a policy on top of it, and it's very hard to know when things work and things don't work. I want to start. So just to mention one last thing in this sense, I want to anyway connect the idea of industrial policies with SMEs, and thinking about some things that I've seen being done in practice that are still, I would say, more as experimental, that I think would be nice having in mind. One of them is the idea of how do you, and this is more of a developing economy way of approaching it, how do you use the idea of supply chain, which we are typically away from global supply chains, but at least it's supply chains. For example, in the case of Chile, we had a chance of doing that with lithium and hopefully some on green hydrogen. But to be able to validate this socially, there is SMEs play they play an enormous role all the time, but a particularly important role of how do you not only support in big companies to establish these sectors or develop them, but how do you connect this with the tejido productivo, productive, I would say, need, or like the smaller, how this expands in the territory has been a very important issue, given that these constraints that I'm telling you have also been coming from the lack of impact in small and medium enterprises. The idea of also of conditionality, maybe not the same that has been talked about here, but conditionality on, for example, in green hydrogen in the south of my country right now, there has been a very difficult to achieve agreement between the government, the private sector, and the region to actually plan more or less the installation of big investments for green hydrogen, where what key requirement has been the transfer of knowledge and technology to SMEs. We'll see if it works, but that kind of conditionality, I would say, is something that is being also done typically for local content. You can also see them sometimes, but the connection of actually big investments in these the SMEs, I think, matters. And just to finish, given that some of the countries or the countries like mine I'm mentioning and others in Latin America have this constraints like small and medium enterprises for them to operate, there are two, I'd say, instruments that are pretty relevant that could actually allow us to, without having resources, to maybe start moving the needle a little bit more. One has to do with actual regulations and standards, because or like putting regulations, for example, for greener technologies, force the private sector to move. But at the end, if you want to include SMEs, you need to at the same time look at the supply side, as Jie was mentioning, of getting the skills and upgrading available too, or instruments like technological extensionism, or like bringing technology upgrading for those to be part of this. And last but not least, something that also Chuck Sable was mentioning in a way, when you have little demand or uncertain demand for SMEs and companies in these new areas or these new ventures, thinking about procurement I think matters a lot. You were mentioning procurement from the USAEA, I think was the name of forgot the acronym. But there is probably a little bit more of development on what is called innovative public procurement, which is actually using the government state, not the innovation budget, but the actual government budget to buy all over the place, to dedicate a small percentage of it into challenges. And again, you don't have to go into the details of actual things you need to buy. You propose a challenge, and the private sector innovates to solve this challenge. So it's a very nice way to tailor public demands, I would say sectoral or mission-oriented goals, and connect SMEs and the private sector and expand the possibilities of having impact when you have little resources in countries like developing countries that are like small and medium enterprises, but from the countries, from a country perspective.
Great, thank you, Andres. So let me do the following. I will pose a question each based on what you said. And then if time will continue, but otherwise I'd love to open up. There's lots of expertise in the room as well. I think they'd love to get into these conversations as well. So first, and my request is just be quick in our responses, just to kind of get more of these conversations going. So, Jie, one thing you mentioned which struck me, and maybe it's because Michela is sitting over here, kind of more the old style of big push Schumpeterian kind of development. And you talked a lot about, look, you know, there's multiple constraints. There's not just a supply side, there's a demand side. You mentioned kind of e-commerce as potentially an aggregation platform as well, aggregating demand. Are we going back to this old style of big push? Is that what you're advocating? Is there now a new reason to rethink all of that? And you know, there's a bit of concern there underlying that question, which is this feels overwhelming for the reasons Andres just said, that now it's not just enough to do one partial reform. We got to come in everywhere at this scale. And maybe that works for China, but I'm sitting there thinking Chile, and I'm like, oh no, what do I do?
No way.
So I think that's a very important question. I think let me tell you like this concrete example that is still ongoing work with in Rwanda, where we're trying to the program is only tackling one constraint. It's not like a big push. It wasn't intended to be a big push. It's just to provide financial, eliminating financial constraints to promote SME exports. That's it. I mean, the program is literally, the market interest rate at 18%, and now it's subsidized at 12%. So very clear, that's the program. But then when you actually talk to SMEs, this program has been there for 6 years. Why are you not taking up? Okay, it's not going to be information problem. They don't know about the program. If the SME really wants to export, they got to know about the program. The government also did a lot of advertising information campaigns to broadcast the program. And eligibility criteria, really no, like, you don't even need to be an existing exporter. As long as you have a plan to start exporting, you can apply to the program. There's no sectoral restriction either. So it's widely applicable to all firms, and policymakers wanted to target SMEs. The program was there for 6 years, but they were not taking up. So it's clear that, just alleviating financial constraints, putting a product out there is not going to solve the whole problem. And then when we talk to firms, why are not taking up? So first of all, they need, to start exporting, it's not just you need money, you need credits, but you also need information. You need to know the global markets. You also need to apply for standard certification, and also just how to write up a good business proposal to, you need to have a, to get the loan, apply and qualify for the loan, they need to write a business proposal, which involves vendor agreement from the suppliers and potential clients. So, and all of that is very overwhelming to SMEs in developing countries, even if they have a good business plan. So I think what we're trying to do in the next phase going forward, which is how can we solve the problem? We're not trying to imagine like a big bundle of different interventions. I think that's, first of all, that requires coordination among too many government agencies. You might want to involve the standard board, and it's just too much to lift it off for given the research team's capacity and the government's capacity, the partners' capacity. So what we're trying to do is essentially 2 steps. The first is use existing data, because in many countries, including developing countries, they actually have a lot of rich administrative data. So, and we have the modern economic tools to try to do our best to predict who might be the potential beneficiaries of this loan product. Okay, and then try to do an extensive listing exercise to first pre-screen really pre-screen carefully to find the right target, the set of firms we think are, could benefit from this, from the export growth fund, the fund, and then reach out to these firms. And that outreach, so we're gonna do a randomized door-to-door outreach so that we can embed a gold standard, impact evaluation in this project. That outreach is not just going to be about information. I'm coming to their door, tell you about this product. They know that already. So I think what they need is more intensive handholding assistance to go from the initial application, to go through the whole application process. So, and how we want to design that outreach campaign, that needs a lot of testing and iteration, talking to firms and to see what kind of assistance they need. But I think this is one example where it is true that we need to go beyond just thinking about one constraint, but it's also not at the extreme where you have to onboard involve many different government agencies to potentially also try to get things work.
So if there's this sequential layer, is there a way you would sequence the constraints? How do we navigate that? Okay, maybe it's not the single constraint, but it's approximate one, or is there a notion of constraints which have higher multiplier effects on identifying, alleviating, revealing other? Start picking.
Yeah, I'll answer this in a very high level, how I think about the problem. I think for any firms are likely going to face many different constraints, and what constraints is most binding for different sectors are going to be very different, right? So we have some other work trying to alleviate information constraint. Thinking about supplier development. How do we integrate upstream SME suppliers with downstream buyers, big multinational buyers or global buyers? There you can imagine many different kinds of constraints, but one thing could be information, where the suppliers have a hard time establishing their reliability or their quality signal quality to the buyers, and their search and matching frictions. But to what extent is this a binding constraint? That is information the binding constraint? That answer varies a lot across different sectors. I think what people, researchers and policymakers do in practice is to first do initial scoping by talking to firms and try to get some ideas about for this sector what might be the relevant constraint, and then dive deeper into that.
Can I complement one thing about exactly what you were mentioning?
Eating into your time.
Okay. That the one source of information which is not, I would say, as accurate as doing RCTs or like experiments on the information you're doing, but are innovation surveys that have been developed all over the place. The CIS is the most typical in Europe. There are a couple of studies that were done by the IDB actually in Latin America to understand the binding, like the biggest constraints for innovation for SMEs particularly or mostly. And again, the idea of what you were mentioning about the connecting of suppliers, etc., that beyond financing, which is the typical thing, with at least relatively good econometrics, a couple of published papers show that like the lack or uncertainty of demand again, to actually be able to generate some stability, to be able to improve, to upgrade, to actually be able to invest on this is a key. And other, like if you think about like the most important, at least from the innovation side, the other one is lack of demand that requires this, what you were mentioning, I think.
Right. I want to turn to something you said. I'm gonna paraphrase a bit of what you said. I kind of read what you were saying is it's people/management matters more than machines. Right? So you give someone machines, you don't get great things happening. You retrain people. There's some evidence to suggest even in modern day times, there's a great kind of case study of Daewoo in Bangladesh, where Daewoo sets up a textile plant, then kind of plant is a failure, but it really, pretty much everyone that Daewoo had in their plant goes and sets up their own little. In some sense, it's a complete failure for an individual enterprise, massive failure. Same sort of stuff. At the same time, and others have papers at this as well, which is training science. Our evidence on training, management training in general isn't. And so this idea, so what I'm trying to reconcile is this notion that people matter and machines matter. Whenever we've tried to kind of retrain people, it hasn't worked. We have to bring in a whole managerial it's not retraining. That's kind of one tension that I want you to sort of sit on and help us understand. The second is this message, and we talked about external validity, so it allowed me to pick fun of a historian to say, okay, is it certainly valid? In a world where machines have become much smarter, potentially smarter than is this idea of, well, the Marshall Plan shows us that it's really important to be. Is that necessary anymore? Are we in a world that, in fact, machines will be able to enable all of these software? Go back to just bring in capital, but just have smarter machines. All the US needs to be now smart machines. That too unfair a prescription. So just comment on both the tension that I mentioned, and then how is it modern machines?
There are two very fair points. On the first one, yes, that's true. The evidence of the effects of training programs, or business training programs specifically, are very mixed. Some show some positive results, some show no results, some show even negative results. So you're doing worse once you get trained. So I think that there are some differences. And some are in terms of the content of what is taught today to business owners or managers versus what it was taught through the Marshall Plan. And also, do we evaluate the success of these training programs on which time horizon? Because going back to the example of the Marshall Plan, so starting from the second point, most of the effects materialize, become sizable or statistically significant, if you want to be more technical, years after the implementation of the program, not immediately. So if there is a training program that follows either the managers of the firms only for a few months, there could be that there are no effects or even negative effects because the content of the program is still not in place, or maybe making structural changes could take time and maybe even have negative effects in the short run, but then in the long run, the effect would be beneficial. The second point is about the content, what is taught versus what was taught. And in particular, the US had developed during the war a method of training called training within the industry that was substantially learning by doing. So you observe other people doing the job, and then you have to redo it yourself and adapt it to the conditions of the firms in which you're working. While today, it's more like there are some standardized training programs, but this learning by doing component is kind of lost. And a third point that you didn't mention, but I think at least historically was very important, is to what extent firms are able to understand that management really matters. And in general, it looks like there is not a full trust in how managerial practices could be important and which effects they can have in terms of firms' productivity. So for instance, going back to the Italian example, firms that apply to the Marshall Plan were already doing better than those that did not apply in terms of employment, in terms of productivity. Not surprisingly, we're less likely to be family-owned or family-managed. So in a way, firms that probably needed the most interventions were those that didn't get it, right? And so this also explains, going from micro evidence to a little bit more macro evidence, why productivity spread continue to be so large across countries, but also within countries, across firms within the same industries, with the narrowly defined industries. So while this is a little bit why do we do observe this tension from the past to the present, so both the time dimension, more what
research on modern machine.
On your second point, so for sure machines are able to do a lot of works that humans are doing here. And this, as Daron also mentioned during lunch, is probably the one of the historical periods in which we're seeing the highest level, the highest speed of technological improvements. To me, the story is about complementarities. So what is the complementarities between human capital and machines? And if we're thinking about low skill or maybe medium skilled human capital, yes, machines could do much better than us, a lot of things that we used to do. But what about the high skill and the complementarities of the high skills? So again, going back to the example of the Marshall Plan, there were some firms that received both the machines and the human capital training, and the complementarity effects were huge. So there was an additional 20 percentage point increase in productivity if you are able to both train the humans and also give them the proper machines. So it looks like that the complementarity effect is what really matters, what we should focus on.
I guess it's also important in some sense because, look, it's easier that the soft skill, the learning by doing it's costly. So the question is for people, for countries, oh, is there a sense that algorithms can serve the role that learning by doing? Would you learn your workforce basically out with algorithms, not just complement, but actually substitute the way? I think that's going to be an interesting question.
Yep, yeah, absolutely.
What that means for SMEs. Does that mean there's more business for SMEs? Does that mean there's less business? There's one thing that you said that I was struck by. This idea that you said it that sometimes it's easier for you sitting with your government hat to engage with the private sector. Right? And that's actually very telling. And all of us have experienced various versions. But you said another thing, which I love this concept of SMC. And even though Jie is saying, look, even in Rwanda, which isn't necessarily as big, we're able to do it. Yeah. But let's take this kind of view further. What I wanted to ask you is there a notion, if I take it even further and say, look, I need scale. Jie by itself will leverage it. Take the second thing, we'll say, well, okay, maybe we should have regional cooperation. You just said, look, it's so impossible for me to talk to a ministry within Chile, for me to do it with Argentina or Colombia or anything else. Are we advocating for a private sector coordinated? Are we advocating where the entire collaboration happens between SMEs in these markets, share innovations, and if there is an interface with the government, it's more that the SMEs practice their own. Does that have any merit in your world? That can allow you to get the process closer to SMEs.
One thing I would say would be that definitely there are experiences where you try to coordinate the private sector on this, where the government probably set up some kind of rules and you allow on probably little incentives, and the private sector actually thrives in certain areas. The example of rice in Argentina could be one, where the government could put some money, but not big, and you can have an impact which is sectorally relevant in a way. So I would say that even though this scale issue is it's big, even in relative terms, if developing countries can, I would say, increase their effort in these areas, closer to what, not even to what OECD has, but closer. Typical Latin American country spends less than 0.5% of GDP in R&D. If you get a little bit higher, you can actually achieve stuff that can matter. Even, especially, I would say, if you move away to only this horizontal, only market-oriented ways of supporting these issues and getting into some sectoral or mission-oriented, I would say, possibilities. But I would complement that with something that the more I was thinking about what to say today, which was not that easy, thinking about the idea of, on the other side of it is, you can achieve better things with the government as long as you start thinking a little bit more about what does it mean to have state capacity. And you don't necessarily need state capacity as to have a big state, which is something of a discussion right now in our countries. We have in Argentina right now, Milei trying to minimize the government as much as possible. There's a huge distrust with government today and mutually with the private sector. Having good people and a good quantity of people thinking about these issues to build stuff with the private sector and to coordinate within the public sector, which is sometimes even harder, I think is of utmost importance today. To generate validity of the government's action, to be able to really construct, not as in arm's length, but collaboratively, but intelligently policies with them, and to be able to achieve higher impact. Because just leaving the private sector with little participation, I haven't seen a big impact of those kinds of policies. And what we have been talking about here has to do with how do you intelligently build more complex policies that require this bandwidth. I remember when Ricardo came to Chile to actually talk with the Ministry of Economy a couple of months ago, he was saying, oh, you should increase the bandwidth of your ministry to actually think about 10 missions. We looked at that and said, like, we're not able to cope with one, which was had to do with green hydrogen, etc. And but it's a very important point to think of what does it mean to have a larger government civil servants that are not thought on the other side of, oh, this is waste, this is just bureaucracy. And having good bureaucracy and how to think of what does this bureaucracy do in this area, I think is very important. It's something we should be thinking about also in how we teach public policy and public management in order to how to do these things later on from the government, which I think matter a lot.
Because it'll be one discussion to say smaller government, leaner government, or larger government,
or capable government. Which what does that mean actually, and how do we?
The danger is you increase size and you get capable, and then you're stuck in a bad.
Yeah, and how do you have like exit clauses on those two? You know.
Let me. There's a couple of things we didn't touch on, but I'm going to open up to the audience in the interest of time. But as we do, if you can weave in things, a few things we didn't talk about is inclusive growth. We didn't talk about, and you'd imagine SMEs. Often people talk about SMEs being more inclusive in certain ways of both in terms of general dimensions of demographic exclusion that they have, women, minorities. But also, I think Jie, you alluded to also SMEs as innovation hubs. The Little Giant program seems fascinating. But also in terms of SDGs, the new green economy. And so as we open up the questions, if we have time, I'd love for you guys to comment on that as well and what you think about the future of SMEs. So let me open up on comments. What I'll do is I'll try to take 3 in a row because I think, and if you can keep your questions to questions, not comments, that would be more helpful. And so why don't I open up and I'll just call people. Lady over there.
Sorry, thank you. Really so fantastic to hear the insights, especially the insights from the field. I had a question about whether you see a tendency to kind of pit supports for SMEs against, supports for large firms. They're kind of often thought of separately, but, given that Jie was talking about the problems that small firms often face, they're even the most basic ones about, how to convincingly write an application for funding. Then you think about, well, what would it actually then take to export and to tackle export markets? That's massive. And so often finding those local markets, domestically is really important. And then who are you going to sell to? Well, you either sell to the government through smart procurement, that's great, but large firms as really important partners in this process. And this is something, you see in South Korea quite a bit, but I was just interested in hearing the extent to which you've come across attempts to enlist large firms, either foreign or local, as partners in the SME process, and what might succeed or fail in that regard.
Hi, so I'm Ferris. I'm a master's student in quantitative economics at NYU Stern. I come from Indonesia, so very interesting example here, Professor Bai. Like it was exactly that I've always been saying that in the e-commerce in Indonesia. So generally, I have this view that I'm quite skeptical of industrial policy for SMEs, for the reason being that, well, from my experience in Indonesia, I see that the sort of economic activity that these SMEs are engaged in are the sort of low productivity activities that may not be particularly easy to sort of scale up or increase the productivity of. So using your example of SMEs selling in e-commerce platforms, a lot of those firms are firms that only, in many ways, repackage imported goods and then resell them again on the e-commerce platform in Indonesia. So to that extent, however hard we try to support these firms, industrial policy for these SMEs will not deliver the sort of productivity gains that will be necessary to drive growth. So my question is, firstly, do you agree with that assessment? And to the extent that you agree with this assessment, do you think therefore the industrial policy for SMEs should be considered from a lens not of growth, but of equity? But if you do not agree with that assessment, can I ask, like, how do you expect to like replicate the sort of industrial policy successes that we've seen in South Korea in this context of SMEs? Like, how can we sort of replicate the same mechanisms, conditionalities that applies to large firms? And we've seen how successful they've been in the context of South Korea and the context of Japan. How can we do the same for SMEs? And this is a very, very important question for like developing countries and policymakers. Like, this is something that I've really engaged in Indonesia.
So thanks very much for your comments. And I'd like to present a challenge to you from the US context. Michela said that Italy in the 1950s might be a developing country. Danny and I are discovering that the United States in 2024 is many parts of which are like a developing country, especially in terms of the policies that are being undertaken. Something you haven't mentioned is not just size, but youth. Davis and Haltewanger have showed that in the US context, most net job growth comes from firms that are under 6 years of age. And this is true across sectors. So anything that interrupts the process of creating and allowing these young firms to grow is a big deal. Since 1990, the share of employment in young small firms has fallen from 20% to 10%. So it's a very big deal in terms of social mobility that hasn't gotten a ton of attention. So how important do you think youth is when you think about targeting? And what are your thoughts about kind of the disappearance of these young small firms in the US context?
So can I request not everyone answer every question just to keep the speed going? So maybe you can choose responses.
One clarifying question. Is it small that the reduction is of less companies or less people in companies? Not necessarily less companies, not necessarily, right?
Do you want to start?
Sure. To the first question about how do we think about integrating SMEs to the larger economy? So China is doing this very intentionally in their programs. They are partnering selected SMEs intentionally with large firms to provide kind of support for their growth. It's not just like one policy, but that's like a bundle, big push. But one thing that I can give you, I think one successful example, Ernesto and I were talking about this morning, which is coming from Latin America, which is how do we think about basically connecting SMEs to the larger supply chain? And the model is Connect America, which is developed by the International American Development Bank, where it is a B2B matching platform. So I mentioned this example because I really feel this is a successful case where not only private partner, IIDB taking the lead, but many governments coming together to at the background to make this successful. So how this works is it's a B2B platform. Every firm, many SMEs, you can start your company profile on the platform and to describe what you do and provide information about your products, and that as a way to market yourself to potential clients, buyers. But what's really a key feature of Connect America is that there is a government certification angle of it. Like, you can, as a firm, you can claim yourself to be ISO certified, or you can claim yourself to be exporting firm. But what at the background, IIDB, they're back-end checking with the administrative data from all of the countries in Latin America to verify that information firms provide. And once it is verified, there is like a badge which is endorsed by the governments, by IIDB working with the governments. So I think that is why Connect America, is successful in the sense that many firms are using it to find buyers and suppliers. And back to the question about scale, I think that is one thing where regional market integration is really key for many developing countries. Penny Goldberg and Tristan Reed from the World Bank has a paper about scale being very important. That's part of the story of China's success. But then for developing countries, we don't have that scale. If you can have a way to reach out to potential buyers and suppliers from other countries in the neighboring countries, that is, that could really yield high return.
Yes, I would like to stay on the question about firm age and firm dynamic. I think it's a very important point. And yes, young firms are those that hire more people, but there are also those that have more uncertain survival rate. Like a lot of firms, 60% of firms, more than half of firms don't survive the first 5 years. So I think that there is a trade-off between the employment of these firms that can have effect on intergenerational mobility, also on more inclusion, more diversity of the firms, but also what are the probability of survival of such firms. So in some cases, the idea of industrial policy of focusing on already existing small and medium-sized firms could be in a way thought as a mean to target firms that already have shown to be solid and to be able to survive. And then there is also another problem related to firm dynamic, not necessarily to their age, which is the generation of managers, especially for family managed firms. So what happens when there is this generational change? Usually the owners, the founders of the firms are those that are doing quite well. And then the second generation, and then the third generation is a complete disaster. So I think that even among the survivors, especially small, medium-sized firms, are also facing these additional challenges. So how can we remain productive when the founder, quote, quote, old management has to stop and pass it back to the next generation?
I want to complement the comment on how to connect small and medium companies with these large corporations that actually can, not through public procurement in the case of the public sector, but from the private side, expand this ecosystem or the supply chain. There's an example in some Latin American countries and in Chile in particular in mining called the Expande program, and it was called before the program of world-class suppliers that actually try to connect and try to develop. The goal was to have a goal to develop a certain, like I think it was 1,000 companies that were like SMEs into world-class exporters of services or goods, but through servicing and agreeing on contracts with big mining companies that were operating in Chile. It has had like a diverse, I would say, evaluations in terms of the impact, and it partly has to do with the fact that the companies that actually were able to improve already were good enough. Sometimes because they had the capabilities or they had some amount of capital or able to invest in improving skills to be able to become these kind of companies. The question is, how do you give time to these programs also to enhance the actual like level of companies that are even like lower in terms of their level of development to be able to become part of this supply chain? I think that is also part of the thing that one needs to think about when thinking about this B2B or connecting companies programs.
Great. So I've been told I only have 5 minutes. So I'm going to get, maybe we won't even be able to get answers, but I think the question. Ricardo, Danny, Ernesto.
Thank you. I think in economics, we have a fantastically delicate palette for analyzing incentive problems. We have a ton of terms, we have a very, very limited set of concepts to analyze capability problems or what capabilities are, etc. So I'm puzzled at this, at the contrast between this finding that the people that went to the US had big impacts, the example that we gave about Daewoo, Daesh, and so on. In the case of Daesh, workers were sent for a 6 months training program in Korea in the company. And for your case, you mentioned that they went to the US. I wonder if there was a matching program, that they didn't go to a teaching place in the US, they went to the plants in the US. And I wonder if there is something really fundamental about just, you say learning by doing is costly, but it's just the only way you learn. You don't learn how to cook by attending a lecture. So I wonder if that's an important insight in the division between these two these two examples.
Yeah, I want to underscore, I mean, the importance of industrial policy for SMEs, because it seems like, there's a perspective on SMEs, which is, why industrial policy should take that. I mean, it's important to realize that that's, is and it's going to remain the main labor absorbing sector. So linking it up with the question of inclusive growth inclusive development that Asim mentioned. I mean, the manufacturing sector is not a labor absorbing sector anymore. Mining sector is not a labor absorbing sector. Export agriculture is not a labor absorbing sector. So whether we like it or not, in the future in all of these countries, the SMEs are going to be where the labor is going to be. So there's no other choice than for a development strategy than to increase productivity in these SMEs. Now, we also have to be cognizant that the SMEs are like these, hundreds of thousands or millions of firms, and the idea that we could increase productivity across the board in all of them is a non-starter. So it has to be that, what we're really looking for is that we really want to identify those SMEs who have a future. So it seems a critical feature of these programs has to be, and in all of the programs you discussed, there was actually a mechanism of selection, so that you want to create an incentives for the more dynamic, the more productive, those who see a future for them to be actually to select themselves into these programs. So some of the, but I don't think the selection necessarily was being designed very explicitly for that. In other words, I mean, Jie, I don't think we want firms to sign up after we give them all the inputs that will relieve all their constraints, right? Because that's sort of like solving the development problem. We want actually just to have those firms where we can provide the inputs that are relatively cheap in our country that will help them, increase. And so I think thinking much more critically and self-consciously about how we design these incentive/selection programs, because you give them an incentive that they want to do in, but they also have to bear some costs that is only those who have some future will be willing to bear those costs. And I think that's how you connect the issue of sort of inclusion and productivity growth, and accept the fact that you hope that most of these SMEs will disappear. And it's only the more productive ones that will survive. Of course, you want entry and the more sort of, things. But the image that we're going to sort of lift all those things up, I mean, that's not what industrial policy, I mean, then it becomes social policy.
Okay, thanks, Asim. So you were mentioning, Andres, that the vertical policies tend to favor large firms and not SMEs. I'm wondering if you're thinking of vertical market interventions. And I can think of, on the bad industrial policy side, you can think, I mean, like concentrated sectors are the ones that can solve the collective action problem and lobby and obtain these benefits. So, and on the side of good industrial policies, like if you think about the infant industry argument, probably some champion will emerge because there are economies of scale and there's learning by doing, etc. So in that regard, I think that you're right. But when I think of vertical public goods, like someone like an institution putting out like a new rice variety or these kind of things, I think that there's a bunch of small players that are affected positively by this kind of public goods. And I wanted to ask you, in your experience, for example, in Chile, with the Programas Estratégicos de la Corfo, was it like biased towards the benefits of the large companies or not? And just a little footnote on what Danny was saying, that like a bunch of like most of the labor force will be in these small and medium enterprises. I think this is even more so in like developing countries where things like in the spirit of this misallocation literature of Jie and Klenow, etc., much more people are stuck in small and medium enterprises in our economies than in the developed economy. So I think this is even more important in that regard.
Thank you. Hi, Florian Bloom from the World Bank. 2 questions on the Marshall Plan. It doesn't happen very often. You get an expert on this. So first, in a way, it was a continent-level industrial policy experiment, right? And one of the macro narratives is that what it did is it integrated Western Europe into a common trading system. It defined responsibilities for Germany to produce coal and energy and steel for the rest. I wonder if you see any micro evidence in the training for the firms that allowed them to export better and integrate within Europe. And then the second question is that what the Marshall Plan did is it solved the transfer problem of aid, right? It helped the US ship American goods to Europe, sell them in domestic currency, and then allow the European governments to use that money for industrial policy experiments. And they used it very differently. I mean, for instance, Germany set up KfW with this as a founding capital. So I wonder if there's anything we can learn from the different experiences of using those counterparty funds for industrial policy. Thank you.
You can get a final answer.
Okay.
So 4 questions. Okay.
That if the SMEs are in the non-tradable sector, the local economy, you help some companies improve their productivity, I think employment will shrink. They'll just displace the other ones. So we have some evidence of that in the program Mi Techo in Mexico.
Okay, so we've been given.
Yeah, I just want to answer the previous question about inclusive growth and also what Danny mentioned about inclusive growth and targeting. I definitely think that inclusive growth, to promote inclusive growth doesn't mean that we want to do blanket wide policies. And in fact, in the e-commerce setting, if you want to do it onboard, just blindly all of the SMEs online, it's not going to work. It's not going to achieve any growth for the intended beneficiaries, first of all, and also it's going to disrupt the market. It will exacerbate market congestion and even slow down worsen market misallocation. I think to what Danny was saying, like targeting is really crucial. Like we want for a specific policy tool, you want to find the right group of SMEs where you can move the needle, that they could benefit from this policy. And how do we? I do think that in terms of both research and actual policy implementation, that selection mechanism should be built into part of the project.
Andres, and then I'll give Michela the last.
Yeah, no, regarding this vertical policies or industrial policies in the Latin American countries, and in particular the ones you were mentioning, there's one issue of who participates in the table, not necessarily who benefits. But if you go to generally to these spaces of putting together the private sector, the public sector, academia, usually the companies that are there are the ones that have the time to go there. And there's no way out of that, at least not that I have seen. It's typically big companies or conglomerates or business associations that represent big companies generally. So despite that, you can have cases where doing that, you can put goals that actually they need to do stuff what's agreed and the government puts money in that benefits and has to trickle down to SMEs. But generally in this type of policies, you then end up seeing typically because of the constraints of SMEs generally. They are not, their voice is much harder to be heard in this space, I would say.
Last words, Michela.
On the Marshall Plan, yes, I find that there was a positive effect on export, both on the intensive and on the extensive margin that is probably related to the creation of the first steps of the European community. In terms of the use of funds, there were 2 parts of the Marshall Plan, one between 1948 and 1952, when the governments got money and they mostly use it to rebuild. While the second phase between 1952 and 1958, where this managerial and technology transfer happened, was more coordinated by the US and implemented in kind of similar ways across all the countries. So for countries that won the war, like France, UK, a little bit better earlier, Italy, Germany a few years later, but the local government had a lot of discretion on the reconstruction funds, but not on the delivery of the management and technology transfers.
Great. I was supposed to summarize everything, but I won't because I think and I think a lot of the comments we got were great summaries anyway. I wanted to thank our panelists for being here. They are here, so I encourage for those try and resolve that feeling by approaching them, and they will guide and help. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.